and welcome back to another episode of Reading Rural YAL. This week we are continuing our first ever deep dive into a trade book with a continued examination of Patrone and Weinhoff-Olson's Teaching English in Rural Communities. In last week's episode, I gave a summary of the book and read the first few pages. So if you missed that, I'd recommend going back to get an overall sense of the book before listening to this week's episode, where I'll give descriptions of each of the chapters. So if you haven't given that a listen, go back and do that so that you have a better idea of what I'm about to talk about. Okay, hopefully you did that. So the book is organized into three main parts. Part 1 addresses why a critical rural English pedagogy or CREP is needed. Part 2 takes us inside rural English classrooms and gives us ideas for how to use CREP in our teaching, thanks to the classroom teachers that Patrone and Weinhoff-Olson write with. And Part 3 describes important ways CREP can help the field of English education and English teaching move forward. So in Part 1, why a critical rural English pedagogy, this part contains a single chapter dedicated to outlining the theory of critical rural English pedagogy or CREP. It addresses the need for this particular theory, especially in the context of an urban normative society and metrocentric field of education and educational scholarship. It also outlines the major tenets of critical rural English pedagogy and the ways that it works to disrupt majoritarian narratives and stereotypes of rural people and places. Part 2, inside rural English classrooms, consists of 3 chapters that take us into classrooms where teachers are using CREP with their rural students. Importantly, these chapters are rooted in the rural identities and experiences of the teachers who are using them with their students. Co-authored with Allie Behrens, a rural teacher, Chapter 2, We Ain't Much to Look At, Teaching About Rurality Through Literary Texts, demonstrates how teachers can engage their students in taking a critical lens to various types of texts, including more traditional print texts as well as multimodal texts, to examine the ways rurality gets depicted and represented in them. This chapter is complete with examples of graphic organizers, questions that teachers can ask students to get them thinking, and example activities in which students can engage to think critically about rural representation. This chapter gives concrete examples of how to do the work that critical rural English pedagogy recommends with real students in real classrooms. Great minds think alike, and I've also written about some ways teachers can do this work. So I'm going to put some links to some of my publications in the description to this video so that you can check those out if you're interested in them. So if you want to do a unit that Behrens talks about and describes in her chapter, those resources might also be helpful to you. The next chapter is co-authored with Melissa Horner, who is Métis, Turtle Mountain Anishinaabe. Through the readings and activities she outlines, Horner wonders who has a place in place-based pedagogy and works to bring a much-needed Indigenous perspective to her critical rural curriculum. Horner outlines and describes a unit she designed and taught with students that focuses on the experiences of rural Indigenous peoples in Montana and across the U.S., as well as rural Black folks, disrupting the notion that rural equals white through students' study of current events, media representations of Indigenous folks, and coverage of the Dakota Access Pipeline protests. That she uses novels and students' own writing too. It's a great chapter, excellent unit, and tons of resources in that chapter. The last chapter in this section was also co-authored with 2 teachers, Elizabeth Ryerson and Catherine Dorian, who each share other ways to engage students through CREP. Ryerson writes about inviting students to engage with their rural communities through the writing and analysis of poetry. In this unit and activity, students go into their rural communities and create found poems based on their surroundings, and she has a local poet, a local cowboy poet, visit their classroom and talk about his writing. Dorian describes a unit designed around a text called Perma Red, written by an Indigenous Montana author. Through this unit, she asked students to engage their close reading skills through reading the novel and other supplemental texts to engage in critical readings and understandings of the experiences of Indigenous rural folks and how that connected to students' understandings of and interactions with their rural communities. At the end of this chapter, there are also a few other entry points for doing this work with students listed, including ways for students to get to know the land under their school, consider different ruralities by infusing curriculum with rural texts, and addressing controversial topics through a rural lens, everything from racism and homophobia to drug use and food oppression. So lots and lots of great ideas and ways to approach using a critical rural English pedagogy in actual classrooms by actual teachers. Part 3, moving forward, is made up of 2 chapters that consider important directions and challenges for rural English education and scholarship. In the first chapter of the section called Rethinking Race/Racism and Rurality in English Education, which is also co-authored with Melissa Horner, the authors discuss the tendency for rural to be coded as white, even though 20% of rural people are people of color. This chapter centers the experiences of rural BIPOC folks in order to challenge and disrupt the notion that rural is white, with the hope that making them visible in these ways can support English teachers and English teacher educators in helping their students and pre-service teachers reconstruct a more representative picture of what rural America looks like so that they can honor the many and vast contributions of people of color to rural communities and to our U.S. society and infrastructure and existence writ large. In the final chapter of the book, Patrone and Weinhoff-Olsen acknowledge and address the potential challenges of and obstacles to using CREP in classrooms. Rather than merely leave it at the challenges and obstacles, they give some concrete strategies for overcoming those. In order for rural teachers to make their classrooms more critical spaces where teachers and students can question what it looks like and means to be rural and how we see that play out across the various texts of our lives. Okay, so that's a lot. But that's the breakdown of all the chapters in the book. There's such a nice balance of theory and practice to this book. It would be great for rural ELA teachers that are in classrooms right now, as well as teacher educators who are wanting to add a critical rural perspective to their methods courses. So I hope you'll pick up a copy. There's a link to the book in the description below, and stay tuned because next week I'll be talking with Patrone and Weinhoff-Olsen themselves in a special edition author talk. So until then, y'all come back now, would ya?